Well, here we are now in week 2. I'm coming to you from my office here at my house. It's pretty early in the morning. My kids have been going to school virtually as well, and so I have to fit my recordings here in when I can, when it's quiet, and you know, really when I can use my daughter's iPad. So that's why the lighting here isn't the best, but that's because it's pretty dark outside still. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to get into, start into one of the bigger areas, one of the more important areas of understanding free markets. That's trying to understand this notion of what's called spontaneous order. Spontaneous order is this idea that markets create order. It's kind of out of nothing. When you have these interactions that exist between humans in the attempt to deal with scarcity, what we find is that markets are kind of this mythical, magical force that brings people together without any centralized coordination. It's as if from the primordial ooze we have this structure that just evolves, and it continues to evolve and change over time. But the changing that takes place is always, almost always at least, in to the benefit of the participants in the activity. So order is created out of nothing, and that's sort of the basics of spontaneous order. But clearly, there's a lot more to it. So I'm going to get into this idea of spontaneous order. We're going to be dealing with this for a couple of weeks, looking at the kind of the interpretations that people have had of spontaneous order, the way that scholars have evaluated and researched spontaneous order, and we're going to look at some really curious cases of spontaneous order over this time. So, kind of put the seatbelts on, get ready, because here we go into an examination of spontaneous order. All right, so here we go. We're starting off with this idea of spontaneous order. Spontaneous order occurs when order emerges as a result of voluntary activities of individuals and not anything that's created by government. And so that's why this is one of those things that free market economists are so interested in. We have this emergence of order without government interference or government involvement. There are different views of spontaneous order. One of the original views is what we call the narrow view. And that narrow view of spontaneous order says that spontaneous order is the result of human action, but it's not necessarily the execution of human design. So it's human action without human design. This is the original view of a guy named Ferguson way back in 1767. So this is even further back than Adam Smith. The idea that order would evolve and that human action would lead to order. So Ferguson's kind of doing this review of human history, and he sees that people, through their interactions with each other, create a very well-oiled order. And it's not that somebody wanted this order or designed this order. It just kind of appears. It just kind of happens. So that's the narrow view, that it's really just human action, and there's really nothing other than that, just the human action, the human interaction. The broad view of spontaneous order says that spontaneous order results from any order, or is the result of activities that lead to any order, as long as private actors are the source, as long as private actors generate the order. So really, it's a broad view because this is something that goes far beyond economics. It's just the order of all society. So this could be political, social, whatever. The narrow view tends to be a little bit more focused on economics. If you are at all familiar with Austrian economics, you might have recognized some of the terms, particularly the idea of human action. Spontaneous order, I'm just going to abbreviate it SO here. This is a staple of the Austrian School of Economics. So the Austrian school, or any school of thought in economics, is just an organized way of thinking about economics. It's you have your classical school, you have your neoclassical school, you have your Keynesian school of thought, the monetarist school of thought, the Austrian school of thought. There's lots of different schools of thought in economics, just like you have them in politics, just like you have them in psychology. But but in economics in particular, we see that the Austrian school has grabbed onto this because of the Austrian school's belief in the importance of the individual, the importance of freedom in the role that economics, the role of freedom and this important position that freedom has and free markets have in economics. So a couple of people in particular here, one Austrian economist, Karl Menger, says that spontaneous order is something that you see in money. So money is a spontaneous order because nobody said you need to have money and it needs to look like this and it needs to have these characteristics. It's just something that evolved over time. So the characteristics of money would include things like it being portable, it being durable, it being relatively easy to divide into smaller units so you can buy smaller or larger purchases, that it's recognizable. These kind of characteristics aren't anything that anybody dictated. Menger says, no, humans needed a medium of exchange and it just evolved as it evolved. It wasn't that someone said gold must be your money or paper must be your money. It just is something that happened. Friedrich Hayek took a very broad view of spontaneous order. Hayek says that things like language and law, and certainly the price system, so there's his economic angle on things, but all of these things evolved without a clear government order, or without any specific order. These are just things that made life easier. So we have a common language and people agree to what words mean, and that the legal system that evolved in any part of the world did just that. It evolved. It did not. There wasn't an organization or a committee that got together and said, this is what the laws will be. The legal system evolves. It changes over time. So these are part of the Austrian School of Economics. And in fact, one of the more prominent Austrian economists, Ludwig von Mises, wrote his magnum opus and called it Human Action. The book is an incredibly long expose, really, on spontaneous order. In fact, there's a Mises Institute that's devoted to the study of Austrian economics. And if you haven't read Human Action, then you're not getting in the doors. So the Austrian School of Economics is really tied up in this idea of spontaneous order, but it's not just an Austrian perspective. Anybody who has studied economics has studied the idea of spontaneous order at some point in time. We can go back to Adam Smith, and Smith's contribution to the idea of spontaneous order is that invisible hand. That idea that there's this force, there's this this thing that's pushing you because it's in your self-interest. This invisible hand is going to basically push you relatively gently to a better outcome for all society. So by doing what's good for you, then you have to help others. If you don't, you're not going to, as someone running a business, you're not going to make any money if you're not doing what other people want and what other people need. So you're being really pushed by this invisible hand to promote the public good. So if you're studying spontaneous order and how things in society are ordered, then what you're necessarily doing is you're being pushed without design by this invisible hand to do things that are going to benefit society. So that's Smith's contribution in terms of, that's one of Smith's contributions to this idea of spontaneous order. So before we get into any more details, I want you to take a look at this video. These are my kids, and they are discovering spontaneous order.
We are going to be playing the Ouchin Maze. So here's how it works. Each person will look at the card in front of them. So go ahead and take a look at that card that's in front of you. Just go ahead and flip it up. Take a look. And then, what does it say?
Go.
Let's go.
Oh, dang.
Who?
Mine says X.
Oh, dang, yours says X. All right, so because it says X, you do not get to go forward. All right? If it says go, then you can move forward. Now, don't go forward at all yet.
Oh.
Flip those back over. Okay? Excellent. Now, if it says go, you can move forward. You can either move straight forward, you can go to the side, or you can go diagonally. All right?
Oh.
Then you look at whatever card you move to next, whatever it says. If it's an X, you go back to the start and start over. If it says go, you can continue.
What about her?
Well, she can move to another row.
Oh.
So
okay.
you do not have to stay in the row you are in. Okay. Now, if you get to the end, then you get a gummy bear.
Oh, fun.
So that is your reward.
Ha-ha.
So
Is it the first person to the end gets a gummy bear, or
everybody who gets to the end gets a gummy bear.
Okay.
But as soon as you hit an X, you have to go back. And if you don't like the row, if you don't like what's going on there, you can always move. So we're going to get a little more light from the lighting assistant here. All right.
That's all I got.
Okay, that's not much.
The lighting guy wouldn't
Okay,
see anymore.
so
Where's Josh with the camera?
let's see if we can do this and have anybody succeed.
Oh, boy. Every time, or can I
Just take a look at it, and you do have to take a look every time, even if you know what it is.
And I'm taking Maggie's row. Nope. Okay, never mind. Whee. I'm gonna. I'll do. Okay. I think we're diagonal. Aha. Okay. Dang it. Okay, so.
So far, no winners.
Oh, goodness.
I have $3.
I'm just gonna go take it. Hold on. Oh no, I'm really straight.
Very close.
Should you be paying attention
Dang
to what your fellow people are doing? Oh,
Oh my gosh.
sorry. I'm helping them to cheat. I don't mean to. Winner, winner.
All right, go back and try again.
I'm just feeling Caleb's route.
All right, go back and try again.
Do I use this now? Or do I have to collect them?
No, you can eat them.
No.
And you do not have to try a different route.
I don't. I can just.
Down her
Oh, okay.
Down the stakes. I'm a dummy dumb. Darn it!
That makes things a little easier.
What? I was wink, 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 wink. What? I don't know.
Try again.
Hey.
Alright. Try again.
I know the secret space now. There's only one way out.
Alright, try again. And you can do the same thing you did before.
I'm just gonna go in the candle room and be like, go.
That's not how you do it.
Illegal gummy bears, Miss Braces.
I have my strap for game.
Well,
Alright, try again.
No, you do this for all eternity.
Are you trying to avoid eating gummy bears?
Try again.
I think fans are following my bit.
2.5 minutes.
Try again. That's alright, keep
Okay.
going. Try again.
This is fun. I like this
Try
game.
again.
Alright. Round and around and around and around. I like this game.
Alright, try
Just
again.
give me the whole bag.
No more gummy bears for Emily.
No! Go fine. Haha.
Alright, try again. Alright,
No, the
try
path
again.
is not looking. Yes.
Try again. Try again.
We're gonna do this until all the gummy bears are gone.
We'll be here a long time.
Better not.
If you do that. I'm waiting for one person in particular here to follow
The train.
the train. Yeah.
Girl, I see. I get it. I get what's happening.
I see what's happening here.
trust but verify.
I get it. I understand
Alright.
what's going on.
It's a train.
My brain is becoming large.
I feel like Dad's giving me a very good like.
There we go. All right. All right. And now maybe you see what's going on here. This is a perfect example of spontaneous order. We didn't have any direction, but they all figured it out eventually. And there are two paths. One is much less efficient than the other. And even the people who found the less efficient path decided that wasn't worth their time and effort because it took too long to get the gummy bears. So they followed the more efficient path, just like spontaneous order in a market.
So how much order does spontaneous order actually create? Or is this just sort of a mind game? Is this just kind of smoke and mirrors? Well, to understand that, we have to understand that there are different levels of spontaneous order. So let's start taking a look at those different levels by examining, first of all, the easy case and making our way up to the hard case. So first of all, we're going to take a look at the easy case of spontaneous order. The easy case of spontaneous order is conducted under the watchful eye, or maybe it's better to say in the shadow of government. So there is some order already in place. There is a government that is kind of running the show, but sometimes the cost of using the state mechanisms to benefit people, or maybe you live in a poorly constructed state, and so the mechanisms there are not the best. This is going to lead to the need for what we refer to as extra legal institutions. So you need some extra legal institutions. These can take on a lot of different roles, but we've already talked about one of these kind of off to the side. We didn't mention it in the context of spontaneous order, but the idea of reputation is really important in these easy cases. When we're talking about reputation, this is a spontaneously ordered mechanism of contract enforcement, and that can solve the problem of state enforcement if state enforcement is ineffectual. So the idea that you need to protect your reputation if you ever want to do business with anyone again is a spontaneously ordered mechanism, because it isn't anything that government says you have to worry about or have to protect. But you will fulfill a contract, because if you don't, it messes up your reputation. So, for example, let's say a restaurant owner gives you a small soda instead of a large when you ordered a large, and you are incensed about this. They charge you for the large, they gave you the small, and so your reaction might be to boycott the restaurant, or to start spreading bad things, providing bad reviews on Yelp about the restaurant. So here you are, you're mad, you're boycotting this restaurant. And as a result of this, the restaurant loses business. They may even go out of business. But the easy thing to do in this case would have been just to give you the big soda. They say, oh, forgive me, here is what you wanted. This makes you happy. There's no boycott. There's no problem with the restaurant going out of business, because reputation solves a problem. You don't need to sue anybody to get this taken care of. And so feedback systems on the internet, things like Yelp, things like Angie's List, or these places where you can provide feedback to other potential consumers, are spontaneously ordered. Another way that reputation manifests itself is when a firm has significant, costly, upfront or fixed costs. I think I mentioned this idea before. When a bank builds this enormous edifice, they're basically saying, hey, we are going to be here for a while. You can trust us with your money. Come put your money in the bank. And if we go bankrupt, we're going to have this huge fixed costs. So we don't want that. We're going to comply with contracts. We're going to treat our customers well, because we want people to come in and continue to be customers over a long period of time. So these ideas of building a reputation are things that help kind of go beyond just the normal legal institutions. So if you don't have satisfaction through a restaurant or at a bank, you can sue them, but that's just expensive, and that is something that interferes with the economy. So this is the idea of the easy case of spontaneous order. But there is an objection. And the objection to this, all of this being spontaneous order per se, is that these forms of spontaneous order work because you have the state lurking about. So because the state exists to enforce contracts, and because people understand that going through the state can be costly and laborious, then it's in everybody's best interest for these things to, these reputational ideas to kind of bubble up and to be part of, just to be part of the system, to be part of the way interactions work. So because the state exists to enforce contracts, then the weak form, or the easy case, if you will, of spontaneous order actually works. It's because of the state, not in spite of the state. So if this is true, then for spontaneous order to be really something of importance, spontaneous order then needs to move beyond the simple reputational mechanisms to secure a more widespread social order. And that leads us to the harder case of spontaneous order. So there's a position taken by people who study spontaneous order that it can only really exist in the absence of government. So this hard case that we're about to undertake looks at the existence of societies where order has evolved entirely outside the scope of government. To an extent, we're talking about anarchy here. So let's break down these different views of the hard case of spontaneous order, starting with the idea or the understanding of what anarchy means, and then moving on to see whether we can have spontaneous order with a little bit of anarchy, or do we need a lot of anarchy for it to happen? So here we are with the harder case of spontaneous order. This is spontaneous order without government. So there's no shadow of government lurking about. This is the removal of government from the picture. So when we talk about this, the shadow of the state limitation on spontaneous order isn't really a limitation at all if there are private actions capable of establishing meta rules spontaneously. So in other words, what we're dealing with here is a system of order that's generated through the private actions of people. And those private actions set the rules for the entirety of society. So the rules that exist are in place even without government. So you really go beyond the contractual rules where law is set up to and enforced by government, and actually you produce the laws yourself, and you also enforce those laws as a private matter. So here we're dealing with the evolution of rules to enforce contracts, to enforce economic activity without government. Now, for this to happen, you need to have one of two things. You need either pockets of anarchy into which the spontaneous order is inserted to create order out of anarchy. If you don't have that, you can't have this hard case of spontaneous order, or you just have a society where there is utter anarchy, where everything is unordered, where government simply doesn't exist. People are kind of running around doing what they want. But that society isn't going to work well unless order is created, and that order is created spontaneously. Because you need a reason for rules in the first place, you need to have some form of anarchy existing. So, the meta rules emerge not because government rules are ineffective or costly, but because the rules don't exist in the first place. So what we're saying here is that you need rules for society to function, and government rules don't exist. And as a result of that, there's going to be some spontaneously ordered rules that evolve. So, let's take a look, first of all, at the situation where we have pockets of anarchy. Pockets of anarchy are the absence of government with the power to govern particular and limited social interactions. For example, some criminal activity has clear order. Some criminal activity exists, and it only can exist within the context of order, particularly criminal trades. So whenever we're dealing with things like drugs or prostitution, there are clear rules of the game involved here. So let's take a second just to watch this real short video clip of criminals who are operating outside the normal bounds of government, engaged in a clear establishment of rules in order to make the transactions that they're engaged in happen more easily, or should we say less violently.
Nosotros tenemos Miami y los hemos dejado solos en Nueva York.
Sí, por un precio.
Por supuesto.
Vea, Pacho, nosotros habíamos quedado que íbamos a compartir el territorio de Los Ángeles. Y eso no está pasando, hermano.
Pues parece que ustedes no están cumpliendo con lo que habíamos acordado.
¿Cómo así? Lo que le estoy diciendo, Pacho. Vea, Pablo. Vos que tenés socios, sabes que a veces actúan independientemente. Si los señores Galeano y Moncada están en lo cierto, tenés la seguridad de que lo corregiremos, ¿oíste?
Muchas gracias, Pacho.
Y la lucha.
So what we've seen here are criminals without government slicing up a market to make it function more efficiently. That's kind of what we're talking about here with the pockets of anarchy. Now, there can, of course, be legitimate business that functions within these pockets of anarchy. So commercial businesses, entirely legitimate businesses, sometimes develop their own set of rules in places where government is dysfunctional. So if government is dysfunctional, where it doesn't exist to the same extent or to the same level of efficiency as it does in some other parts of the world, then commercial businesses might set up their own set of rules so that things can be done, so that commerce can be engaged in. So why does spontaneous order rise in these cases? Well, it rises because there are gains from cooperation that exist, and without the meta rules that the spontaneous order institutes, those gains won't be captured. So really, what's going on here is that rules are created so that gains from trade can be realized. That's what spontaneous order is doing in this situation. So think about it this way. Let's say that you are in your house and you want to leave your house to go down to the market. However, someone is waiting for you outside of your house, and this person has a gun, and they shoot you, and you die, and they take your money. And so knowing that that might happen to you, you never leave your house. That's a situation where society and the economy and everyone really is poorer because there's a lack of institutional control, a lack of rules that are enforced. So there's now clearly a huge incentive to find a private solution, because in this case, the government solution isn't working. The government is dysfunctional. So the incentive for a private solution is greater than the incentive to develop institutions where government is involved. So let's take a look at a more historical example, specifically focused on international trade. Back in the 10th and 11th centuries, people involved with shipping and involved with trade were finding that that they were coming into common dispute with some degree of regularity, and they didn't have any court system or any legal system to bring their disputes before. There weren't any, like there aren't any today. There weren't any supranational agencies to enforce contracts, and there were no world governments with the ability to enforce anything. And additionally, there was no international commercial law. So in order for these trades to take place, in order for contracts to be enforced, there was this pocket of anarchy. There was this place into which order kind of seeped, into which order filled the void, and these things became known as merchant courts. Merchant courts were places where traders could go to have disputes adjudicated. So if there was some international commercial disagreement, then they would go before the merchant courts. This evolves into a full-blown body of private international commercial law that is known as the Lex Mercatoria. Where people could go, where traders could go if there were disputes. And because of the similarity of disputes, basically these courts build up a body of case law, just like we see in the normal legal world. In this case, it was done entirely outside of the realm of government. So while this Today, what we see is that private arbitration associations, instead of the merchant courts, settle disputes. So the merchant courts really don't exist anymore, but there's a private system of arbitration. And these arbitration associations are private, and you don't have any military or violence to enforce them. But combined with reputational concerns, so here we have this private court system plus reputation equals a pretty well-oiled legal system that was created without the role of government. And especially considering that 20 to 25% of world GDP is involved in international trade, the fact that we have a private system that enforces contracts and that people can go to when there are disputes is actually pretty amazing. So this is what we mean by pockets of anarchy. And when there are these absences of government, then we have the potential, at least, for spontaneous order to step in and fill the void. The other situation is when we have utter anarchy. And when you have utter anarchy, you can't rely on government for any purpose. And you would really need an encompassing spontaneous order to govern all interactions. So here we have not even the resemblance of a government, not even a dysfunctional government. There's no government at all. So probably the best example of a situation of utter anarchy is the situation of, or the existence and the remarkable set of rules and order that governed the behavior of pirates. Because there were gains to be had, but only if there was order, there was a huge incentive in the pirating world to find private mechanisms to secure cooperation and order. So let's take as we wrap this today's lecture up, let's take a real quick look at kind of the Disneyification of pirates and what they think of when they think about order.
Wait! Make good the clear what? You have to take me to shore, according to the code of the Order of the Raven.
First, your return to shore was not part of our negotiations nor our agreement, so I must do nothing. And secondly, you must be a pirate for the Pirates' Code to apply, and you're not. And thirdly, the code is more what you'd call guidelines than actual rules. Welcome aboard the Black Pearl, Miss Turner.
Miss Turner, you have found out that the pirate codes don't apply to ye. We're going to talk about some pirate stuff because pirates provide a really, really interesting illustration of spontaneous order. And those pirate codes are a little bit more than guidelines. If you violate the pirate codes, you're going to find yourself down in Davy Jones's locker. So, when we get back together, we're going to talk about pirates and spontaneous order in the pirating world. So until then, avast, me hearties, yo-ho!